Welcome to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Gyn. Now, with news out of the United States that vaccines for children under 12 are now ready to begin, parents in Canada are asking when the shots will be available here and discussing whether they will or won't vaccinate their children. When parents disagree about issues like this, it can cause serious conflict, and the disagreements can even end up in court. For separated and divorced parents, the question can be an especially contentious one. The issue of childhood vaccination and parental disagreement has already been addressed by Canadian family law courts in the non-COVID context, and the COVID shot has been addressed by courts in a few cases with children over 12. What guidance can parents find on this topic, and how should parents think about having these conversations in a way that's collaborative and productive, even in a high-conflict situation? Here today to talk about this issue are two family law experts, Sean Knights and Anthony Martin. We'll then be joined by stepfamily counselor Brittany Lynch. Now, Sean and Anthony, thank you both so much for joining me today. Anthony, let's start with you. There have already been cases on childhood vaccinations in the non-COVID context. What are the main principles about whether a child should be vaccinated against, say, measles, mumps, rubella if the parents disagree?
So the main question the court is going to ask is what's in the child's best interest? And I think it goes without saying that it's in the child's best interest to be vaccinated. In the pre-COVID era, case law on vaccination was pretty much unanimous. If there was ever a dispute before the court would typically land on the side of the parent who's seeking to have that child vaccinated.
Now, Sean, I know that this can sometimes come down to what's in the separation agreement, who has medical decision-making authority. But is what's in the separation agreement the last word? Or can a parent who doesn't have that decision-making authority challenge the decision of another parent?
I would say that a separation agreement is possibly and likely not the last word if a parent were to challenge it in court. Certainly here in Ontario, and likely it's similar across the country, the courts can disregard any provision of a domestic contract related to decision-making if it is in the best interest of the child. So, even orders can be changed through a motion to change if it meets a certain test. So the courts are more and more, in vaccine cases, choosing to override separation agreements in favor of vaccinations, especially if the child is over 12. And so I would say that even if you have decision making with regards to medical decisions in the separation agreement, that's not something to gloat about.
Now, Anthony, there have already been some disputes about COVID vaccines for kids over 12. What are we seeing in the courts about this topic?
So the case law that's coming out now, the court's taking judicial notice that vaccines are beneficial for children. So I think it's any litigant who approaches the court to make an argument that the child shouldn't be vaccinated, they shouldn't receive the COVID-19 vaccination. It's really a losing battle. There was a case out of Saskatchewan in which a petitioner was relying upon some questionable medical evidence, making analogies with the Nuremberg Code and some bizarre arguments. It's just not going to fly. I think that as these cases come before the courts, they're all going to be decided in the same fashion.
Now, Sean, same question to you. What have you been seeing in these disputes, and what guidance might we expect for kids under 12 as that will ultimately head to the courts as well?
Well, I think as a child gets younger, the views and preferences of the child is going to be less and less important. However, one of the exceptions that we have seen is, for example, there was a case where a 13-year-old decided that they did not want to be vaccinated in a vaccine case, and the court didn't order them to be forced. That's probably going to be unlikely to happen. But courts should not have to be deciding whether vaccines are safe. When a parent exercises the courts will look at situations where a parent exercises their decision-making in such a fashion as to not follow routine medical advice or advice from public health guidelines that is universally given. The reasonableness of that parent's decision-making process is what's going to be looked at. So it's not good enough to print some stuff off the internet. You're going to need an actual medical expert or scientific expert to give evidence.
When we come back from this commercial break, we're going to dig in more to some of these questions around childhood vaccination and family law. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing COVID vaccines for kids. Now, Sean, I think that the factual context is perhaps different for kids. You know, I really support vaccination. I'm vaccinated. My kids are going to be vaccinated. But I know that this virus, just factually speaking, is less dangerous for kids than it is for adults. Does that, and especially for seniors, and that's what I've been hearing from the people that I know, that I'm friends with, who are concerned about vaccinating young children in particular, who seem the least sort of vulnerable as long as they're otherwise healthy. So does that change the analysis from the courts at all, that the case for vaccination may be more for protection of society at large than really about the health of these kids?
Yeah, so we haven't really seen any cases yet as children under 12 overall are not vaccinated. However, I think it does change the analysis, because when you're looking at the numbers maybe across the country, we're looking at very small numbers of children that have died as a result of COVID-19. And so the court is going to have to consider different factors. For example, if a parent decides that their young male child has a higher, or puts forward evidence that they have a higher risk of getting some heart problem from the vaccines than they do from other issues, I think the court would have to consider that. But overall, I do think that the court would side with vaccination. However, I don't think it's impossible for a parent to make a good argument given the evidence, because there's a lot of information we still don't know. And as a result of not knowing, the scientific community may not be in favor automatically of vaccinating children of that age.
Yeah, the heart inflammation one is an interesting one. My understanding is the risk of heart inflammation is actually significantly higher if a child contracts COVID than the risk they could get it from the vaccine. But certainly it's one that I hear anecdotally from a lot of people. Anthony, your views on this, about the factual situation on the ground here and whether that changes the legal analysis?
I still think it's going to be tough for the parent who is opposed to vaccinating a child to make a compelling argument before the court. As I indicated before, the court has taken judicial notice on this. And that's just, as more and more cases come before the court, I think that precedent is just going to be even more entrenched.
Now, Sean, I'm not advocating for this. I know you're not going to advocate for this either. But what happens if parents disagree and the parent who wants vaccination unilaterally does it? What type of consequences could there be for a situation like that?
Yeah, I suspect that could result in a radical change to decision-making responsibility, and even potentially the removal of that parent's decision-making ability over that child. The court, if there's an agreement and you just go against that agreement and do what you want to do, so I think that that would be a major problem if you did it while, for example, litigation was happening. But the facts always change. For example, if the court found the other parent was more unreasonable for other reasons, then that may not result in that. But if there is a dispute, I would suggest that parents simply go get a decision or come to an agreement before just making unilateral decisions that may impact their decision-making ability over the child for the future.
Now, Anthony, I want to touch on something Sean said earlier about the child's role in coming to this decision. Obviously, 5, I think, is probably too young for the child's input to make a significant difference about vaccination choice. But at what age does it matter? Is it 13, or is there a hard and fast rule about when the child gets to decide?
Well, the Healthcare Consent Act doesn't have a minimum age. Any decision regarding a child's medical treatment, such as vaccination, is an incident of decision making. So if you have a parent who has that ability to make that decision, they make the decision on behalf of the parent. There is case law in which both parents have decided they don't want to have a child vaccinated, and the child wants to be vaccinated. In that situation, the child can approach the court, and the court would determine whether or not the child can make that decision if there was a dispute.
That's certainly an interesting proposal. It takes a lot of guts for a kid to do that, I think, to stand up to their parents. But I want to thank you both so much for coming on. I get a lot of questions about things like this, so I really appreciate you sharing your expertise today. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing COVID vaccines for kids and family law. And we're now joined by stepfamily counselor Brittany Lynch. Now, full disclosure, I have worked with Brittany. I have a blended family myself, and she has great advice for how to actually have these conversations and maybe avoid going to court if you can possibly do that, which is usually what you want to do. So, Brittany, how much concern around this topic of childhood vaccination are you seeing among blended families? Is this a serious point of contention for a lot of families, or is it okay in most situations?
Well, in my opinion, as it is, parenting is a really delicate balance between being an art and being a science. And for as long as what's best for the kids can be interpreted by different people in different ways, there's always going to be an opportunity for conflict to arrive, especially in co-parenting relationships. But when you really zoom out and reflect on how contentious the nature of the to vaccinate or not to vaccinate debate has been historically, not even in the context of COVID, and then you stir in the fact that life as we know it for the past 2 years has been pretty significantly disrupted. It comes as no surprise that this is a really polarizing issue that parents and non-parents have to navigate.
Now, I think what's concerning for a lot of people here is there really isn't a middle ground here. You either get the kids vaccinated or you don't. And, I understand when there are times to compromise, but in this case, it's pretty black or white. And for parents on both sides of the debate, they view it as this is about the health of their child. Whether you're pro-vaccine or against it, this is about the health of your child, which is incredibly precious. So what are some strategies to work through a disagreement when really it's a zero-sum argument?
Mm-hmm. I think the answer to your question is within the question, right? You really hit the nail on the head by saying that both parents view this as being about the health of their child, which is very precious to each of them, regardless of which side of the spectrum they fall on. So if you really distill the arguments that both parents are using, right, both by folks who choose to vaccinate and folks who choose not to vaccinate, you'll realize that both sides are essentially fighting for the same thing. And when you really think about it further, most parenting decisions are binary like this. It's either, they play football or they don't play football. They go to private school or they don't. They go on their class trip to Europe or they don't. You're going to be able to find an argument to support both sides. So with all things, especially in co-parenting relationships, the key to really arriving at a conclusion that hopefully ends with both parents feeling satisfied with their decision is to keep the best interests of the child at the center of the decision-making process. Because when it turns into a war of which parent gets to win the battle, then it's not the other parent who loses, it ends up being the kids.
Yeah, that's so often the case in co-parenting and divorced families. It becomes less about the interest of the child and more about winning and losing and the power struggle. So how would you recommend approaching the conversation with your co-parent if you don't want to escalate things? How do you frame the ask, whatever it is you're asking for?
Mm-hmm. So I want to kind of build on my last answer by restating that, the best interest of the kids needs to be placed at the center, which we say we can understand when we're not in a super emotional state, right? But when we're in the heat of the moment, that might feel like a hard thing to reach for. So I understand that when someone's really passionate about a decision like this one, and when someone is certain that their way is the right way, there's a tendency to really want to grasp onto that and hold on to that with all of your might. But if you go into a conversation like this with your co-parent with the sole intention of proving the other parent wrong, making the other parent wrong, winning the argument, then you've already lost. So instead, if you start the conversation by listening, and I mean really listening, right? Not listening to try and figure out what you're going to say in response. But if you hear what the other parent has to say, that old cliche that you catch more bees with honey couldn't be more fitting. So entering these conversations with your guard lowered, setting the tone by leading with curiosity rather than defensiveness, you might be really surprised at what ends up happening for you. So for example, a phrase you
Brittany,
might try.
can we get into that when we come back from the commercial break? I want to hear your example, but I think leading with listening is great advice. We will be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing COVID vaccines for kids and family law with step-family counselor Brittany Lynch. Now, Brittany, in the last segment, you were telling us about how parents can have these conversations in a way that doesn't escalate, and specifically leading with listening to your other co-parent. And what's an example of what that would look like?
So I know that this might feel like a bit of a stretch for some folks, depending on the specific type of co-parenting relationship that they're in. But if you can, for example, start the conversation with something like, I know how important the kids are to you. I know how much you love them. I appreciate that you're such a good parent to them and that you're always looking out for their best interests. I'm curious to hear your perspective on what you think we should do when it comes to their vaccination status. If you enter into the conversation that way, immediately everybody's guards are disarmed, right? Then nobody's trying to win a fight. It offers a platform for hopefully both parents to be heard in that situation.
Now, sometimes these things do end up in court, which is when emotions can get at their highest. What advice do you have for parents if they do end up in court to try to control their own feelings on either side of this dispute?
Sure. This is such a great question. I'm rarely one to prescribe one size fits all advice, but I think that this specific advice can apply to everyone. And that is that at all costs, do not let looming court dates and obsessive record keeping consume your every waking moment. You know, there's something I've observed that can happen to step families when court's on the horizon, and that's that your whole entire world gets really shrunk down to be all about that date that you're going to court. So something that I offer my clients as a strategy to try on for themselves is to set aside a designated chunk of time, whether that's an hour a day, 2 hours a day, 20 minutes a day, whatever feels right to you. And that time that you've set aside is specifically intended and allocated to be your sit and think about court time. So you sit in there, you set your timer, you think about all the things that could go wrong, all the things that could go right, all the what ifs, and you just allow yourself that space and that time to be there worrying about it. And then when your time is up, to the best of your ability, you leave your thoughts about court there for the day, knowing that tomorrow you're going to be able to come back and think about it again. Creating those strategies, to allow your thoughts not to be the one that's in control and your obsessions not to be the one in control can really help to save your sanity and your emotional health and your physical health leading up to really stressful times like court.
So because, as we said, this is one of those zero-sum situations, you either get what you want for the child or you don't, whether it's because you came to an agreement or because it went to court. So if you don't get the outcome you want, if you're a parent who didn't get the outcome you want, what advice would you have for managing those feelings so that you can still have a productive co-parenting relationship with the other person?
Mm. It's really, my personal and professional opinion that anyone who is involved in a co-parenting relationship should have a therapist or mental health professional or support system that they can lean into when things don't go their way. And unfortunately, we really need to work as a society at reprogramming the way that we believe about these situations instead of, I didn't get my way here, right? And what does this mean, and why is this a big problem? To just, this is the way that it is. I'm allowed to have my feelings about that. I'm allowed to work through my feelings about that, but it's not necessarily something personal that somebody needs to take personally and get offended by.
Really great advice, Brittany. People can learn more by visiting stepqueen.com. Thank you so much for coming on today and sharing your expertise.
Thanks, Christine.
We've heard today about the challenges that separated and divorced parents are dealing with when it comes to COVID vaccination and their children. With the approval of vaccines for kids under 12 on the horizon, the issue will likely be seen in courts and in counselor offices. We've heard today about some strategies, some legal and some practical, about dealing with these conversations. While always keeping the best interests of the child at mind is always core to all family law decision-making. That's all for this episode. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Christine Van Gyn, and remember, a freer Canada starts with you.